Hello everyone and welcome to the video on world systems theory. So what we're going to do is look at an overview of world systems theory, what it is, what it tries to explain, and then run through a timeline of world systems in general, and then we're going to end with a look at some of the more common critiques of world systems theory. So what we want to understand in particular when going through this is understanding the central question of why do we call poor countries developing and rich countries developed. So this is very common when it comes to trying to distinguish between poor and rich countries. The terms developing countries, developing nations, as well as the developed world are extremely common. They're used by NGOs, by governments, by supernatural organizations like the UN and others. However, they do come with a certain set of encoded values as well, and a particular way of looking at the world. So the biggest critique of using these terms really is that it presupposes kind of a linear progression from underdeveloped, developing, and then developed countries. That somehow countries which are developing or underdeveloped are somehow not quite as advanced as developed countries, and this is a linear pathway that countries, as they progress through various processes, will become developing, and then after further progression will become developed. World systems theory is very much a critique of this way of looking at the development of countries, and proposes a fairly radical counter narrative of sorts. So it's very closely associated with Immanuel Wallerstein, an American sociologist. He is a sociologist, or rather he was a sociologist, although world systems theory, often also known as world systems analysis, is not a single discipline theory. It's a multidisciplinary theory influenced by a range of different academic disciplines. His preference is to call it world systems analysis rather than world systems theory, although theory has stuck. And it combines politics, society, and economic thinking to arrive at a very different way of understanding the world. So rather than dividing the world into this kind of linear timeline of underdeveloped, developing, and developed nations, Wallerstein divides the world into three distinct areas: core nations, semi-periphery, and periphery nations. However, these relate to their economic function within a single global economy or a single world system. So this is a very different way of looking at things, because this doesn't presuppose that there's some kind of linear progression, but rather core countries and, let's say, periphery countries are just as modern as each other. They're different not because one is more advanced, but rather because they play different economic roles. They have different economic functions. So this is very much a critique of the current or the common way of thinking that economic development is a national characteristic. So nations and countries have their own economic development. This is an understanding that economic development occurs within a single global system. So because a country has a particular set of economic characteristics, this is because of the role it plays within a single globalized system, and not because of just individual economic decisions that have taken place within that country, or the governance of the economy of that single country. It recognizes how interconnected the global economy is, and therefore recognizes that we cannot understand how a single economy functions without looking at its role and its function within the global economy. It's worth pointing out here that this is a neo-Marxist analysis, so it's very much a radical way of trying to understand the world within the Marxist tradition. Is not a traditional Marxist theory, but it does take this traditional way of understanding the means of production and ownership of the means of production to the global level, rather than just the national or local level. So if we look at the map here, so this is a map of one way of understanding the division of countries between the core, semi-periphery, and periphery. There is an understanding that countries can and sometimes do move from one category to the other as their role in the global economic system changes. But again, it's not that one country is less developed than the other, but rather the actual functions they play. So we see the core countries are by and large Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and so on. And many countries would have many maps of this sort, would also put South Korea and other similar countries there. So what we would understand as the global north, whereas the periphery countries are largely in Africa, parts of Asia, particularly the Middle East, and also parts of Latin America. Whereas the semi-peripheries would be the countries that we would often call the BRICS nations, so Russia, China, India, Brazil, as well as the Mint nations, Nigeria, Turkey, and so on. So if we go on to actually take a look at what the economic functions of these three different categories are, so core states, so what we would understand to be the global north or the developed world, are highly industrialized. They often produce manufactured goods, specialize in information, finance, and service industries, particularly those with global reach, are generally technologically advanced, politically stable, strong public infrastructure, and are economically diversified. So they will have a variety of industries and are involved in a variety of different economic globalized processes. This isn't to say that these are processes which are primarily domestic. They are primarily international. So despite specializing in, say, manufacturing manufactured goods, doesn't mean that the raw materials will be domestic. The raw materials will be taken from other countries with other economic functions. Specializing in information and finance, again, there may be other countries involved in the supply chain. The economic diversification again relates to globalized economic processes rather than just strictly domestic economic processes. So if we move on to the periphery states, so we're jumping down to the lowest level. So periphery states are weakly industrialized. So again, this is large parts of Africa, Asia, and South America. Weakly industrialized, so usually not diversified, but rather dependent upon a single industry or the export of a small range of raw materials. The investment that comes in from the core or semi-periphery states are usually for natural resources or unskilled labor. Also, in many cases, to sell the manufactured goods which are produced in the core or semi-periphery states. A low technology base, which is dominated by foreign companies rather than domestic companies. Frequently politically unstable with poor public infrastructure. And again, the opposite of a diversified economy, so dependent upon a single or a small number of income streams. So that would be the big distinction between the economic roles of the core and the periphery states. And when Wallerstein was initially developing world systems theory or world systems analysis, these were the two different categories that he placed countries in. But since then, he has added the additional category of semi-periphery states between the core and the periphery. So these are the BRICS nations or the Mint nations. So these are buffer states. So they play an important role in actually deflecting political pressure that would otherwise be directed against the core states from the periphery states, encouraging regional competition, regional rivalry, and therefore having an important stabilizing role with regards to the political pressures within the world system. They're generally industrializing states which are in the process of diversifying but are not globally dominant. So again, looking at countries like India, China, and Brazil, they fit very neatly within this, that they are diversifying, they are industrializing, but They're not in a position of being leaders in particular technological fields. They're not globally dominant players, although there are moves towards that. They're expanding into manufacturing goods, but by and large, ones that the core states no longer find profitable. So if you look at the bulk of Chinese manufacturing, you'll see that within the value chain of, let's say, smartphones, the largest portion of the value chain will still reside in the core countries, and the activities that the semi-periphery states like China actually undertake are largely ones that are not profitable to actually run within the core states. So actually final assembly may well take place in China. Manufacturing of various components may well take place in China as well. But the largest portions of the value chain, things like the actual design of the technological components, software coding, software and hardware design, will still take place in the core states. So they have a stabilizing role. Semi-periphery states will help stabilize the world system, encourage regional rivalry and regional competition. They will take on some of the manufacturing aspects of global supply chains that are no longer as profitable to run in core states, but they are still very much within this single global world system. So if we take each of these three categories and each of the distinct economic functions, we get to an overall global world system which works to accumulate surplus value in the core states. So periphery states will export raw materials, or unskilled labor or semi-skilled labor will be used, and then semi-periphery states will add some form of manufacturing input or other forms of input, but the overall function of these global supply chains and these global value chains is to take surplus value and deposit that within the core states. So the trade patterns that we see within this context are not accidental trade patterns. They're trade patterns that will work to actually take value in the form of material or labor, and through globalized economic activity, the largest portion of surplus value will accumulate in the core. So this is why Wallerstein and proponents of world systems theory are very critical of the terms developing and developed countries. If you have a developing country and you call it developing, the very language itself, the term developing, implies that if you keep doing certain actions, eventually you'll become developed. But within the lens of world systems theory, developing and underdeveloped nations should not be called as such, because they are just as modern as the global north or the developed world. They play different functions, or they have different functions in a world system. So the reason that, let's say, Togo or Pakistan or Yemen are not rich, prosperous countries are not because they have failed to take certain steps or they have failed to implement particular policies. It's because that their function is very different to the function of, say, France or Germany or Canada or the United States. That their function is not to have surplus value accumulate within their borders, but rather to provide raw materials, to provide unskilled labor, and the actual trade that they depend on, the integration of their economies into the global economy is such that asymmetrical trade will inevitably lead them to have different economic outcomes than the economic outcomes of the US or Canada or the UK. This means that if we take this to its logical conclusion, understanding the global economic system through the lens of world systems theory or world systems analysis means that we can understand that this global division of labor, this specialization, this different economic functions that different countries play, will never lead to effective or sustainable growth for periphery states. There may be some individual periphery states that may shift to semi-periphery status, such as China, for example, may be a really good example of this. But this is either down to specific conditions, so the specific economic conditions of China are not ones that can easily be replicated across the world for other periphery states, or they will arise where stability, political stability is needed, and regional competition is required to produce, a stabilizing effect on the world system as a whole. So by and large, most periphery states, by their engagement in this global world system, in the global economy, means that their short-term profits may arise, and they may be necessary to actually conduct governmental business. So exporting raw natural resources may be a political necessity, but the long-term output is going to be stagnation and poverty, because the value that's accumulated and generated through globalized economic activity is being deposited in the core states rather than the periphery or the semi-periphery states. We can see this as well in not just the asymmetrical trade patterns, but also in how trade functions structurally. So with the kind of trade concentrations where poorer nations have either a single or a very limited number of core states that they trade with, whereas conversely core states will trade with a very wide range of periphery nations. This is largely but not completely mapped against former colonial relationships. So if you look at the trade relationships that the UK has, it is largely, not completely, but we can map out the British Empire and the former British colonial states, and we can see that they have either just the UK or the UK with maybe a handful of other states as their primary trading partners, whereas the UK and France will have trade with a huge range of periphery countries as a consequence of their large, diverse spread of former colonial possessions. So this relationship and this range of structural relationships reinforces the economic role and the economic function of the periphery states as well. So we see then that the global economic system as a whole is functioning in such a way that periphery nations remain chronically underdeveloped, chronically funneling surplus value and profits to the core. And this isn't a bug, this isn't a misfiring of the global economic system, but rather it's the natural outgrowth of the type of global economic system that's in place. It is really important at this point as well to highlight the fact that this is not some form of conspiracy theory. It is a radical critique of the existing economic order, but it's well within an established type of Marxist economic analysis, and it relies upon structural rather than conspiratorial features. So it's not something which is being consciously imposed from above by some cabal or secret backroom of people smoking cigars and making secret plans, but rather it's just the natural outgrowth of the type of ideological system that's in place, a type of global capitalism, sometimes termed hypercapitalism or late stage capitalism. So it's something which companies and individuals and nations are engaging in, not necessarily because of a belief in some kind of tyrannical secret regime, but because it's simply the way the modern capitalist system functions. There are a few other components as well that will keep this world system together. So ideological belief in capitalism and in international trade tends to be a major one. So the belief that this type of hypercapitalism will ultimately produce positive benefits, the belief that international trade will always be a net positive, will drive actors, whether they're governments in the periphery states, whether they're individual companies, whether they're individuals, that have some sort of influence or some sort of decision-making power will drive them to stay within the world system, simply because there is an ingrained ideological belief that international trade and hypercapitalism or late-stage capitalism will ultimately produce positive outcomes. As well as this, military dominance can play a major role. So we have a long list of economic interventions as well as military interventions, covert and overt, in various parts of the world. So some of this is very much on the documentary record. The CIA's role in, as well as British Petroleum back then, the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company, the coup to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in the 50s. Because of the nationalization of Iranian oil is something which is very much on the documentary record. Various interventions in Latin America, again, very much on the record as well, to preserve economic policies and regimes implementing and engaging with the global economic system, as well as the semi-periphery, something which encourages regional rivalries and conflicts, and very much keeps the focus on individual regions rather than allowing pressure to build against core nations. Right, so that was a brief overview of world systems theory. Please do read about it in more detail. There's lots and lots of material out there. Wallerstein sadly passed away, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but he's left behind a website with lots and lots of writing. He frequently wrote commentaries on major political and economic events. And there's lots of other scholars who are working within the field using world systems theory or world systems analysis to conduct their own research and develop their own analyses. But what we're going to do now is take a brief look through a world systems theory global timeline. So it's important for us to understand what we mean when we say systems in world systems theory. So Wallerstein did not use states, empires, or individual countries as analytical units, but rather he focused on on systems as his base analytical unit. So, understanding that a system is a interaction of different units, which are reproduced, which is relatively stable, has some means of division of labor, provides a hierarchy of some form, and therefore is useful for us to understand as a single economic system. So we have mini systems which arose very early on in human society, so homogeneous units relying on hunting and gathering, and then some forms of simple agriculture and industry, and it's noteworthy here that all major necessary goods and services are produced and consumed within the unit. So there's relatively little reliance on trade between different mini systems, but everything which is produced and which is needed for consumption is produced within the mini system itself. If we move on and start looking at world empires, so now we have much larger economic entities. So you can think about things like the Roman Empire and the Persian empires, where you have a distinct core. So whether it's Rome or whether it's the center of Persia, you have resources, surplus goods, raw materials, which are extracted from the periphery or from parts and regions which have been conquered by these world empires, and the profits from economic activities will accumulate within the core, so within Rome itself, using the example of the Roman Empire. This will be distributed within the hierarchy, so some to the administrative classes, some to the military, others to political elites. But again, we have a cohesive, coherent economic system. So again, what we're not doing is trying to understand individual countries or individual states' economic systems. Rather, we're looking at the economic system within this kind of a broader lens of both mini systems, world empires, and then lastly world systems. So Here we have the same kind of economic system, the extraction of surplus value from the periphery, and accumulation of value and profit in the core, but on a global scale. So because it's a global scale, there is no unified political structure. So we don't have a global empire or a single global state. The political structure is fractured, but it's enough to keep the economic functioning of the global world system functional. So you still have the extraction of value, you still have the accumulation of profits within the core, and you still have a self-sustaining economic cycle, even though the political governance is split amongst different countries and different political entities. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just take a brief look at some of the major critiques of world system theory before we wrap up. So it is important to highlight that while we've been going through an overview of what world system theory is, we have to recognize that this is a radical critique of the existing economic order. It's a very radical critique of the way the bulk of traditional scholarship on global economic theory, on developmental economics really works, and it is a minority perspective. It is a neo-Marxist perspective, across these different disciplines. So there are lots and lots of very potent critiques of world system theory as well. It's a really important academic perspective to consider and understand, but not one that we should adopt without really thinking about it. So one would be that world systems theory or world systems analysis has too much of a focus on economics and not enough on culture as explanations for human behavior. So if someone wants to understand why particular trading patterns have emerged, why particular types of economic activity predominate in some parts of the world, the critique here is that economics is not always sufficient to understand or get the answers to these questions, that human behavior is driven by a range of different things, including culture, social factors, historical factors, and just trying to use economics as the primary way of understanding human behavior is doomed to fail. Secondly, there's also a critique that there is a lack of falsifiable predictions made by world systems theory. So this is one of the major critiques and one of the reasons why Wallerstein himself objected to the use of the term theory. So theories will make some kind of prediction, and that this is the way this particular human phenomena or human behavior works. So if we have a theory, it will both explain existing behavior and will make predictions as to future outcomes. So this can be falsifiable. So this is the basic way science works, both hard science or physical science as well as social science. Wallerstein insisted on the term world systems analysis because there was a recognition that there was a lack of falsifiable predictions, and instead this is an interpretation of history and political events. And in fact, there is a common critique of world systems theory that the outcome is inevitably world revolution is the only real recommendation that can come out of this. That if the entire global economic system is the problem, then there are very little practical policy recommendations aside from dismantling the entire global economic system. As well as these two quite broad critiques, you also have particular critiques by orthodox Marxists. So we said earlier that world systems theory is a neo-Marxist framework or a neo-Marxist theory. It's not an orthodox Marxist theory, and that's because there is a lack of focus on social class, as well as a lack of focus on the state as the primary unit of analysis. So Wallerstein and other theorists and other academics working using world systems analysis or world system theory do not look at the state as the primary unit of analysis, but rather look at the system itself for all the reasons that we've mentioned. And also look at the way economic systems function, the way value accumulates, rather than just looking at social class. So that's a common critique amongst or from orthodox Marxists as well. So as well as these critiques, we also have some others. So one would be on just how abstracted world systems theory can be. And so a lot of the analysis that we can derive from applying world systems theory will not be very specific, will be generally quite generalized, quite abstract. And this doesn't take into account unique circumstances or unique combinations of historical factors in understanding events or trade patterns or relationships in particular parts of the world. So this is quite closely linked with another critique that Wallerstein didn't take into account or didn't have enough focus on post-colonial movements and liberation movements, forging unique economic systems and unique economic relationships that aren't really accounted for within world systems theory. So, for example, Cuba's use of trade, particularly trade in kind, so receiving things like oil in exchange for medical services is something the Cubans have done quite frequently. That kind of taking traditional concepts of international trade and recontextualizing them, reforging them for particular purposes. Again, the fluidity and complexity of how post-colonial states and liberation movements have actually functioned is not just uncritically accepting dominant paradigms of trade policy, but rather have in some cases been quite unique and distinct in how they've understood and applied economic and trade concepts. Right, so hopefully that's been of use. Remember, this is just a primer. We're just kind of exploring the overview of world systems theory. There's lots and lots to dig into, and I would thoroughly recommend going through both academic texts and academic journal articles to really dig into more detail of how world systems theory or world systems analysis can help us understand trade patterns in economic activity in the world today.